make sure it comes up on here. Hello everybody, it's Joan coming to you today from Joan's Kitchen, and today we're going to be making Pappa Pomodoro, which is an Italian bread and tomato soup. Pappa, I learned, it's the Italian translation of the word for pap, which means mush, so it basically means like a tomato mush soup, and that's because the consistency that this soup has when it's done. It's not a real liquidy, soupy consistency, but it really is kind of a mush. And we're going to go through it and you'll see what it looks like at the end. I've prepared a couple of things in advance today so we can shortcut it and I can show you how to make it all the way through. And I wanted to mention that this recipe is vegan. There are no meat or animal products in it. The way that I'm making it is not gluten-free, but it possibly could even work with gluten-free bread if that would be something that would be a concern for you. And I want to give credit for this recipe. The recipe came from Gabriele Corcos, who's also known as the Tuscan Gun. He and his wife, Debbie Mazzar, started out many years ago making videos cooking Italian kitchen in their home. At the time they were living in LA. They live in Brooklyn now. Ultimately, they got picked up and they had a television show on the cooking channel that was called Extra Virgin. And they actually put together a beautiful cookbook called Extra Virgin that won a James Beard Award. And it was the bestseller on the Italian cookbooks list with the New York Times for over 6 months. So I highly recommend this book. It's easy and everything in here is tasty and it's ingredients that we can easily get here in the US. This kind of recipe was developed to use up leftover bread, and this came from the tradition in Italy that's called Cucina Povera, which means the poor kitchen, and it's the philosophy that nothing ever goes to waste. So to make this, we are going to use tomatoes. I have some crushed tomatoes here. You can also use fresh tomatoes, but canned tomatoes are just fine. If you do use fresh tomatoes, you want to put them in boiling water to take the peels off and then kind of mush them up. I have fresh garlic in the recipe. For the vegetable stock, I'm using Better Than Bouillon vegetable stock, and I'm assured that Italian grandmothers do use bouillon, so this is fine to use. I have extra virgin olive oil. I have fresh basil. Fresh basil is very important. You can't use dried basil for this. Fresh basil just has such a strong flavor, and the flavor of that is really critical to the dish. And then I have my bread. This is stale bread that I cut up into very thin slices. You cut it up into really thin slices so that it can easily get absorbed into the liquid for the soup. Okay, so I'm going to start here. I actually started this up a little bit ahead. So in our pan here, I have some olive oil and some garlic. I've actually pre-cooked the garlic a little bit so that it wouldn't take too long. And I'm just going to get that heated up again. While we're doing that, I just want to reiterate that the ingredients in this are very simple ingredients. The type of bread that you want to use is basically Tuscan bread, which you might not be able to get here in the States. And by the way, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask the questions. If I can, I would love to answer them on the live. If not, drop a comment in the box and I will answer after the live recording is done. Tuscan bread is unusual because it's made without adding any salt. And the story about this is that back in the 1200s or the 1100s, Pisa, the rulers of Pisa had some kind of a feud with the rulers of Florence. And Pisa is on the ocean, so they were producers of salt, and they withheld their salt supply. So the Tuscans, being very ingenious, figured out how to make bread without salt. So Tuscan bread traditionally is made without salt. It's a little bit hard to find that kind of bread here in the States unless you have a really great Italian bakery near you. So what I used was something that was just called a rustic bread. You could also use French bread. You want to look for as few ingredients as possible when you're putting it together. And if you don't have leftover bread that's turned stale, it's fine to slice up the bread like I did and leave it in a low oven maybe for about half an hour. I had this in a 250-degree oven for about half an hour, and it's totally stale. So my oil with the garlic is starting to heat up over here, and the next thing that I'm going to do here is add in my tomatoes and my fresh basil, and I'm going to show you what that looks like when you add it in. The basil leaves are whole, they're not chopped, and I'm going to put them in just like that. When you're making this, you do want to reserve some of the pretty basil leaves to use as a garnish on the soup when it's done. So I'm just going to put that all in here, and the tomatoes and the garlic oil, which are kind of heated up, are going to make the basil leaves kind of wilt into the sauce. And so that's what's happening here right now. And I'm going to lift this up again to show you, which I hope you can see in there. The basil leaves, kind of like spinach, when you put spinach in oil, they really just wilt right into the sauce. So I'm going to cook that down just a little bit. This would be cooking for about 15 minutes, and when that's done, we're going to be adding in our stock. I actually have a pan that's prepared up to that point, so I can show you what happens when we put the bread in. One of the things that I wanted to talk about is where Pisa is, Livorno. That's actually the port. It's a huge shipping terminal over there, and it's just outside of Pisa. Pisa actually has the same river as Florence, the Arno River. It goes through Pisa as well. And the port where the big cruise ships come in is actually in Livorno. So if you ever go on a cruise and you have a port called Livorno, you can be sure that going into Florence is going to be one of the shore trips that's going to be offered for you, because that's the closest port to there. And I highly recommend spending more time than just a shore excursion in Florence. It's one of my very favorite cities in Italy. It's beautiful, it's historic, it's small so you can walk it, and the Duomo dominates the landscape, so you can see everywhere the Duomo around the city, so you kind of like never really lose your bearings there. So this is starting to bubble away here, and I'm actually going to swap this pan out for a pan that's a little bit farther along, which is right here. So this pan, a little bit earlier, I added the vegetable stock in, so you see it has kind of a soupy consistency, and I'm going to bring that up to the boil here. And when I do that, that's when I'm going to add the bread in, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. There are a lot of other Italian recipes that call for using stale bread. Again, these all come from what's called the cucina povera, or the poor kitchen. It's the philosophy of not wasting any food, because food sometimes was scarce, hard to come by. Some of the other examples of recipes that use stale bread include ribollita, which is another Tuscan kind of a soup. These soups end up being really thick, they're really more stewy. The ribollita is something that you use up any kind of leftovers that you have and put in the leftover bread. It traditionally has the Tuscan kale, which here we would call the dinosaur kale. It's the thin, really dark green leaves with texture kind of like a dinosaur skin. And that frequently has beans in it too, and that's also a really good recipe. I've made it without leftovers, just made it with the ingredients because it's so good. I want to stop again. If anybody has any questions while you're watching, please go ahead and ask, and I will do my best to answer it. A couple of other dishes using stale bread. In Trentino, there's a dish that's called canardelli, which is kind of a gnocchi that's made with the stale breadcrumbs and served with melted butter. There's also in Emilia something called panna, which is the stale bread mixed with eggs and cheese, which might be kind of similar in an Italian way to the chilaquiles that I made the first week, which was using Mexican leftover tortillas that has eggs and cheese in it. There's also something that's called pasta ammolicata, and that one has breadcrumbs that are mixed in, and it's made into a pasta sauce, so you have breadcrumbs on top of the pasta. And then the other one that's probably pretty well known here in the States is something called panzanella, which is a salad that has leftover bread in it, and they're a lot of times made like croutons, where they might be sauteed with some garlic and olive oil and it being a component of a salad. And this soup, you know, being vegan and having very little fat in it, the only fat is from the small amount of olive oil that we use to saute the garlic. It's considered to be a healthy recipe by dietitians. And again, this is something that you could make vegan. I'm making it vegan here because I'm using the vegetable stock. Some of the recipes call for actually taking the dried bread and soaking it in water first to make it soft. This version that I'm using actually has the vegetable stock mixed in with the tomatoes, and that's the moisture that we're going to be using to melt the bread into. And it really does kind of get melted into into the stock here. So I'm just waiting for this to come to the boil, and when that comes to the boil, I'm going to be adding all of this bread in there, and the bread is immediately going to start soaking up the liquid, and it gets to have kind of a mushy consistency. When I've added it in here after this comes to the boil, I take this off the heat and I just let it sit for an hour. I actually cover it so that the steam goes back into the pan and gives a little bit extra moisture. You can stir it while it's sitting, and you'll see the bread swells up and absorbs the liquid, and it does become kind of mushy. I saw a recipe from England where they referred to the consistency as porridge, which is a good description. It kind of is like grits or cornmeal or even oatmeal when it's done. And the mush, they also call it baby food because the consistency is such that anybody can eat it because it's so soft. But I wouldn't let that dissuade you from making it because it's really such a very, very tasty dish and simple, quick to prepare, healthy. Again, I just want to emphasize that you don't use dried basil in this. Using fresh basil is really critical to the flavor of this dish. So this is starting to get pretty hot over here, and I'm just going to put in all of this dried bread that I have here and start stirring it around. And the bread was in little slices, but as it absorbs the liquid, it's going to start to break down, and as I stir it, it's going to be able to break down, so pretty soon you're not going to be able to distinguish the slices of bread. So let me quickly show this to you over here so you can see the slices of bread kind of in the tomato and the stock there. I'm going to keep on stirring it, and the bread is very quickly absorbing the sauce. And you know, again, the consistency of this soup, it ends up being really more of a stew. It's something that you could actually eat with a fork rather than a spoon. According to the recipe and according to the history, this is also a dish that you can eat really at any temperature. You can eat it hot, you can eat it at room temperature, or you can even eat it chilled. For me personally, I like to have it kind of in the warm to hot category. I think having it be a little bit warm really brings out the flavor of the different ingredients that are in there. And when it's done, you finish it off with a nice little stir of some really, really good olive oil, which just gives it a shine and that extra little bite if it's a nice fresh green olive oil. And you top it with some basil leaves. Gabriele Corcos, the man who I got the recipe from, who is from Fiesole, which is just outside of Florence, says that this is a recipe that you never, never, never add cheese to. You just eat it the way it is. And Italians are very particular about what goes with what. So I'm going to go ahead and turn my burner off here, but I'm going to show you that the slices of bread are starting to break down into the sauce here. And as this sits for the next hour, and I stir it occasionally, they're going to break down even more. So even with the crust on there, you're not really going to be able to distinguish the shape of the bread loaf anymore. It's going to just totally break down. So I have over here some that I made ahead so you can see what the finished product looks like. I have it in a nice bowl that is actually from Deruta, which is close to Florence. And here's the consistency. You can still see the basil leaves in here, which are kind of like broken down. They've really wilted in there. Here's a fresh leaf of basil, but it's just kind of this consistency, like a mushy consistency with tomatoes in the bread, and the flavor of this is just excellent. And really all you need to finish it off is just a little swirl of some really good olive oil, which I'm just going to put like a tiny bit on there right now, just to finish it off. And there you have it, the Pappa Pomodoro. I hope that you enjoyed this. If you want to get the recipe from me, I'll be putting a link in there for you to request the recipe, and I would be delighted to send it to you. I hope that everybody is having a safe and healthy Memorial Day, and let's pause and remember the people who gave the ultimate sacrifice so that our country could be free. And I'm going to have a little toast to that. I'm drinking a wine today that's called Casteggio, and this is from the Lombardy region of Italy. It's a Barbera, and it's delicious. So chin chin, and I will see you again next week.